Do your players treat long rests like a button in a video game and try to hit it all the time? This video will help you to keep your players and their characters awake and engaged as you extend their adventuring day from a 5-minute workday into a full resource grind, or anywhere in between. My name is Timothy, though some people do call me Tim, and I am a professional DM running over 300 games of Dungeons & Dragons a year, and I'm here to help you keep your party moving and the dice tumbling with fewer pillow forts. Today, we'll break down the rules problems that make long rests so easy to come by, and you can expect tips on managing rests, guarding against too much tent time with some tiny hut tactics, and making sure that every in-game second counts and is counted. Let's get to it. The rules for resting in 5th edition are fairly lenient in a lot of places. They've been carefully crafted, and I do think that the design is honestly not that bad. Unfortunately, there's a couple of things that tend to catch us up. It's a fairly common mistake for DMs to miss that the final paragraph of the long resting rules tells you can only benefit from one long rest in any 24-hour period, meaning that in order to return back to camp and go back to bed after a 5-minute adventuring day, you are looking at an incredible amount of time spent sitting around twiddling your thumbs and doing nothing. Unfortunately, because Dungeons & Dragons is a role-playing game and not something that we live out in real time, that doesn't have the same weight upon our players that it would have upon their characters, and that dissonance is where a lot of the problems come up in our game. We can't really force people to sit through 16 hours of sitting around at a camp doing nothing before they can even be tired enough to go to sleep. And so we have to do something that can help to either narratively pull them forward or mechanically enforce the need to continue an adventure until such a time as you have brought it to a natural conclusion or a natural means of retreat and rest. A long rest is defined in the rules as a period of extended downtime, during which a character sleeps for at least 6 hours and performs no more than 2 hours of light activity. It says that the rest can be interrupted by a period of strenuous activity, which it then defines as at least 1 hour of walking, fighting, casting spells, or similar adventuring activity. There is some debate about how this set of wording is parsed or should be parsed, because it could be that an hour of walking is the only thing that's supposed to take an hour, whereas you could also read it that an hour of adventuring activity like fighting or spellcasting could be the case. But given that a combat round is only 6 seconds, the idea of an hour of combat being what breaks rests is a little absurd. My thinking is that probably any kind of combat or spellcasting or adventuring activity is liable to break a long rest. That said, even if that is not your interpretation or the interpretation that you've been dealing with at the table, we can still help our players to stop trying to mash the long rest button. With that in mind, let's address what actually will help us to change our players' behavior. Consequences. It seems to me like consequences are almost always the answer to questions about what we need to do in order to drive our players to get into their characters better and be able to make choices that are more appropriate to the situation. It's the answer to a slew of different problems, including murder hoboism and general disregard for the story at hand. In this case, it's integral to many of the different solutions that can help our players to begin adventuring in a manner that sits in the narrative a lot better than work 5 minutes, rest, repeat. However, it is important that a couple of principles are followed when it comes to issuing consequences for your character's actions. The first of those is that consequences need to be natural. They do need to fit into the story, and though we are crafting these consequences and sometimes improvising them on the fly, we need to make sure that we're not doing it out of a desire to punish our players for their behavior or to force them into changing their ways. Though we would like to encourage our players to extend their adventuring day, ultimately we do need to realize that going into any kind of battle at your absolute prime is a sensible character thing to do. And so if there is an opportunity that we leave open for them to go out, do a short amount of work, and then retreat to rest, it does actually fit the narrative. We need to make sure that the consequences that we're leveling for that style of play are suitable to the situation, so that players have to help their characters make decisions that fit the world that they're in. Similarly, it's very important that consequences are foreshadowed, because if a character doesn't know that there is a consequence to their actions, we can hardly blame them for making a choice that issues those consequences forth. If your players have been safely hitting the long rest button on a regular basis and there's never been anything that happened terrible to them before, why wouldn't they choose to do exactly that in sessions to come? A surprise here and there can be a load of fun, but when it comes to trying to guide players towards a different style of play, it is generally true that foreshadowing the trouble that may follow them leads to either greater innovation as a player in what their characters are going to do in order to earn the rest that they so desperately desire, or to act in response to that consequence in another manner that's going to lead them to continue their adventuring day further and further. One of those consequences that doesn't appear in many of the different adventures that are being published nowadays is the good old-fashioned wandering monster. Random encounters naturally break up the flow of long rests and can put parties into more dangerous situations. Sometimes those encounters might be fairly minor, but other times they might be minor encounters that lead to greater troubles. If a goblin scouting party finds where your group is but don't have the numbers to take you down, their first cowardly instinct might be to go and grab their boss and everybody in the dungeon and come back and overwhelm your resting place. Getting players to take proper precautions to avoid these sorts of things is a way to ground them in the narrative and, again, earn that rest instead of just pushing that button. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, the spell Tiny Hut. A third level spell that essentially encloses the group in an invulnerable bubble that has only a handful of hard counters and allows you to sit there safely and even shoot arrows out at anybody who happens to come nearby without even placing yourself in any danger at all. Tiny Hut is the bane of many a DM in that it has no resource cost as a ritual spell and allows the party to essentially set up camp anywhere they happen to be and quite comfortably settle down for any length of rest that they desire. In order to do so, all they need is the 1 minute to cast it using a spell slot or 11 minutes as a ritual. Obviously, not every group is going to have access to Tiny Hut, but given that it's not only on one of the most popular cleric subclasses, it is a straight up wizard spell, and as a ritual doesn't cost that wizard much to have it in their spellbook. But there's more than one way to no, we don't talk about that here. But there's more than one way to break a tiny hut. And though the most obvious answer that is often bandied about is to have some form of spellcaster who can cast Dispel Magic, that's not always feasible in the narrative that you've got going on. And again, we want consequences to be as natural as possible. But several other potential ways of luring your adventurers out of their invulnerable hut include having creatures run off and get reinforcements after a random encounter has stumbled upon your tiny hut. Just like the goblins in the earlier example, if you go and grab the entire dungeon and camp it just around the corner from wherever your adventurers plopped their tiny hut, they're going to be in for the absolute fight of their lives on the morrow when they try to break out at full resources and completely overwhelmed by numbers. Similarly, any sort of ambush could be set up as inventive denizens of your dungeon use means to shift barricades in front of the area to seal them in where they might be, perhaps dumping buckets of mud upon their hut so that they can't see what lies outside and thus can't safely predict what's coming. Likewise, you can lure characters out of their tiny hut with things like prisoner executions that are being held outside, calls for parley and discussion from the dungeon denizens, or even just temptations, which we'll talk about next. Remember, essentially, that while the tiny hut is up, the world is still continuing forward. And while 8 hours is a long time for people to be sleeping, 16 hours stuck sitting around doing nothing is even longer. Which is why, in a little while, we'll be talking about how to provide time pressure. But when it comes to temptations, realize that it doesn't take much to lure characters out of their tiny huts. A noise in the distance, the glimmer of shiny loot on the belt of the creature creature that's about to flee away after encountering them in their hut, the sounds of distant combat, or a scream of somebody in pain. Adventurers don't like knowing that there's something going on just outside of their reach and that they are not involved in it, which allows you to not only help to lure them out, but to provide for those stubborn few who stay inside some additional in-character consequence. As innocents die, treasure escapes, and the source of your noises resolve. Players are there to be a part of the adventure, and when the adventure comes to them, they want to be a part of it. If you make the adventure about creatures being unable to penetrate through the hut that they're in, then they are participating in it. If you make the adventure about what's going on just outside of their reach, well then, you've got a recipe for pulling people into your action once more. If you want a particularly dirty mention of a way to keep a party moving, the Night Hag's ability to haunt people from the ethereal plane in their dreams and the dream spell itself are two particularly ugly ways to force your characters to get a leg on and get moving. Lots of people think that a tiny hut could protect you against a Night Hag, but a strict reading of the etherealness ability tells you that they are physically moving to the ethereal plane. Things on the material plane don't affect the ethereal plane unless they specifically say that they do, which means a Night Hag can freely pass through the tiny hut's barrier and then return to reality if it needed to, or from there start messing with your dreams and giving you nightmares. Similarly, Dream is on a little bit of shaky ground because Tiny Hut states spells and other magical effects can't extend through the dome or be cast through it. However, the Dream spell technically has a target of self, and the ability to appear in the dreams of your victims is a result of that spell's successful casting. Tiny Hut's wording is likely not meant to exempt creatures from that kind of interaction, though that is something of a ruling that you would need to make at your particular table. Of course, something to always keep in mind is that combat encounters are not the only encounter, and so when we're trying to encourage players to step out of their tiny huts, remember that anything that's going to encourage them to utilize resources to find out what's going on around them or to interact with the world is still a success at getting them to move into the narrative and act. Even a friendly NPC stumbling upon their hut and wanting to sell them an object of power that they have or talk to them about something pertaining to the adventure that they're on is a great way to lure them back into the story. From there, you could introduce some time pressure with that NPC if you haven't managed to foreshadow it enough already. Though this video is not sponsored, it is brought to us by Matt Laser as a Monday Musing option. But the topic just got me going. If having your question answered by a professional dungeon master sounds like something you would like to do, then don't forget to like and subscribe, and then feel free to drop a comment to this video or any other asking a question, and I'll do my best to answer. But for now, let's talk a little bit about time. There are a lot of things in a D&D adventure that can be time sensitive. We typically put the big ticking clock over in the distance for a lot of major plot lines in our adventures. The end of the world is going to happen one way or another, it seems, and we like to make sure in our adventures that the adventurers are aware of that possibility. However, we usually don't put too fine a point on that ticking clock because we don't necessarily want to make it to where our characters don't have the ability to do all of the things that they have to do. But you can create smaller instances of time pressure consistently and constantly throughout your adventures that are going to pull people forward and encourage them to extend their own adventuring day without you having to find some ham-fisted method of forcing it upon them. A couple of easy options to input to encourage your adventurers to continue are things like a set of competitors. If you've heard of a group of rivals who are also seeking to solve the problem that you're looking to solve, then the natural competitive nature of many of your players is going to come to the fore, and their characters are suddenly going to want to push harder. You can leave signs or foreshadowing of these competitors easily laying about as they take a long rest and find that several of the rooms of the dungeon have been slaughtered and taken care of. Take the loot away and leave your adventurers in the tiny hut parking lot right next to their rivals who took care of a few rooms and then, like they, return to rest after just a 5-minute workday. A second option, and a favorite in many adventures, is the ongoing ritual. Anytime characters go into a long rest situation or even into a short rest in certain situations, you can go ahead and move the plot of that that forward. Perhaps even if you don't want the ritual to come to complete completion without the character's presence, you could give it a partial success that is going to make encounters more difficult in the future. If you're, for instance, attempting to summon a great demon lord from the pits of the abyss, perhaps the portal opens up enough to allow some of its minions through early that repopulate the dungeon as the portal grows wider and wider to allow the more powerful demon to enjoy its freedom. A third option is to include prisoners in a dungeon that are in some form of danger. Including prisoners in and of themselves is not necessarily going to be enough to encourage your players to push past the situation that they're in. After all, these people have been in prison for a while and they're probably going to stay that way. However, if you have a group of prisoners that are being slowly sacrificed to this ritual that's ongoing to summon the demons, then what you have is a recipe for haste in your party. Placing your prisoners in danger or dangling them as danger in front of your party is a great way to encourage them to push forward. Most players really enjoy being able to portray the hero, even those players that are looking to do it as an anti-hero. A final option, though certainly not the only options available, is to have somebody important that might escape if your group does not press forward. Foreshadowing this with stories of the cowardice of the creature or that it had run from a previous place is a great way to set things up in a way that tells the party that if they don't pull this off, either by not letting any information get to their target or by pressing through the entirety of his or her defenses, then he's going to flee away and you're going to get to create another dungeon that they're going to have to force their way through in order to catch him. Or perhaps some kind of cool chase scene or other adventurous activity that's going to be fun. Because regardless of how you're trying to encourage your players to increase the amount of time they spend adventuring and decrease the amount of time they spend lollygagging around doing nothing, you want to make sure that every moment at your table is a fun moment that allows your players to enjoy themselves. When we try to correct people's behavior, sometimes we try to do it by making the game not fun for them, and ultimately that's just a losing situation. But if you're looking to make your players engage and keep them from long resting too often, you're going to have to master foreshadowing. Check out this video to up your foreshadowing game, and thanks for watching. Happy adventuring.